Welcome, everyone. Margaret Morabito, she had worked at Run Magazine, and she had worked on doing some online teaching early days. She's going to be talking about that online education. Last year, she had done a talk mostly about her story and what she did. She helped to write the book for Bill Hurd. What is it called? Entering the Storm?
Back into the Storm.
Back into the Storm. All right. So she wrote that book with him. He dictated her and he helped her, and she wrote the book. So she now going to talk about, since the theme of the show is computers in education, that's one of the themes. She's going to be talking about online education in the vintage computer days. So welcome, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. I'm coming to you from New Hampshire, so I hope we keep our connection. All right, well, Jeff already told you a little bit about me, but I'll give you a little bit more background. And this will give you an idea of what led me into the field of online education. I started off as an English teacher. I taught at the Naval Academy Prep School and also at Fitchburg State College. Then after that, I became the head of a computer learning lab for the Army at Fort Devens, Mass. And when I was there, we were teaching basic programming and word processing on Apple IIs. Early on, I could see that computers would be useful for education. And in 1982, I started a small school, the Computer Assisted Learning Center, CALC, which was an offline small learning center where I taught word processing using DEC Rainbow. So shortly after that, I joined Run Magazine as a technical editor and writer for them. And also during the mid-'80s, I became the education writer for LinkUp, which was a telecommunications news magazine. Since 1986, I've been directing an online school, and it's still in operation today. And lastly, as Jeff mentioned, I'm the co-author with Bill Hurd on Back into the Storm, which is his story about his work at Commodore. But also, I'm the author of a book called Online Distance Education, Historical Perspective and Practical Application from 1997, and also the Vintage Commodore 128 Personal Computer Handbook. So with that said, let me move ahead here. In 1980, I got a C64, Commodore 64, and right off the bat, I started writing programs, educational programs in BASIC. And there were probably a lot of people doing similar type of programming. When I got to Run, I found out that really there were lots of teachers who were already writing programs on their Commodore 64. And these were different types of programs that could be used for education, such as a tutorial, which is a picture of what I have here. Also, drill and practice. That's where the student would, solve problems or go through vocabulary quizzes, explanations over and over again. And that's where you get the word drill from, just going over these things to eventually learn them. Educational quizzes. This is an example of one. And they're very simple, but this is the type of programming that we were seeing back around 1983, 84. And also educational games. So there were a lot of teachers out there on various levels of education who were writing programs. And so it was quite interesting to see them and also to participate in that. Also, at that time, I was writing for Run what's called the Resource Center column. And I've got a picture of this up on the screen now. And it was aimed mainly at parents and teachers who were using computers for education. Since Run was a Commodore magazine, of course, we were focusing on how they were using their Commodore computers for education at home and in schools. And I was also, at that time, during these years, writing a series of articles about telecommunications, because at that time, there were lot of networks that were coming up, new networks that were open to the public. And this was something that we were covering in Run. And then I started writing for Link Up. And of course, that was their focus, was telecommunications. So I was doing the educational aspect of telecommunications for Link Up. So with all of this, I was able to get a broad view of the ways in which computers were being used with telecommunications for education. And today I'll be talking about the early development of online education, and I'll also discuss my own contribution to this area through my school, which is called Cal Campus. So now I'm going to start way back, the roots of correspondence education. Correspondence schools or distance education schools, they actually started back in the 1800s. And when we were in a few years ago, 2020, suddenly our schools, many of our schools were hit with the need to provide online education. And teachers suddenly were thrown into this role of teaching online, teaching essentially through a distance education format. And some of this was successful and some of it wasn't. And it was primarily the ones that were not successful were due in part to a lack of training in correspondence education and using the online medium, and also a lack of infrastructure, which would be needed to support an online school. So just to go way back in time, there actually was an established plan for distance learning. And this is something that we continue to follow today, essentially. And that includes lessons written in a self-explanatory way and arranged in a series, supplemental instructional materials, a series of exercises, essentially homework exercises that would be done by the student, and evaluation by a competent instructor. So these exercises would be evaluated, comments would be sent back to the student, and testing would be done in the same way. The student would do the test, and a competent instructor in that subject area would provide the grading. At a minimum, there was a final exam. This is stemming back from the 1800s, but of course, there's more than just a final exam. But at a minimum, that was the way it was done. The earliest method of correspondence education used print materials and surface mail. Now, we'll see as I go through this how that has changed over time. One of the earliest correspondence schools was Exeter College in England in 1850, and they developed what they call their new extension system, which was a non-resident program for students who were not in the same area as the teacher. In America, the Society to Encourage the Studies at Home was developed in Boston, Massachusetts in 1873. And that was developed by Anna Tickner. And she was using, her method was based on mailing letters back and forth between the student and the teacher every month in combination with guided readings and frequent tests. So you can see that was basically following this plan. And this was something that for decades was followed using essentially surface mail and writing back and forth between the teacher and the remote student. As we get further in time, up towards the mid-1900s, we've got early technology, which expands distance education. And we're talking, for the early technology, we're talking about things like radio, eventually television, audio, video cassettes, later on faxes, telephone, and even more recently the CD-ROM. It played an important role in the development of and changes in distance education throughout the world. Universities began by using audio cassettes and open broadcast technology such as radio and TV. Some early leaders in this area were outside of America. For example, the University of South Africa, as early as 1946, they were offering a distance learning program. And they were using printed study guides, tutorial letters, and traditional textbooks. By the 1960s, they were also using audio cassettes for lessons, delivering the lessons. And by the 1990s, they were using the internet. In the 1970s, England started the Open University for adult distance learners, and they began by offering instruction through radio and television, supplemented with printed materials, videos, and audio cassettes. Like the University of South Africa, by the 1990s, they started to use the facilities of the internet, and they used it for instructional delivery and student support. The third early example of this is Athabasca University in Canada. And they were using a combination of tools to deliver instruction and receive assignments, including telephone, fax, voicemail, and eventually email. By 1994, Athabasca was offering an MBA online, and they also had regional learning centers around Canada where students would go for in-person support. So all three of these universities are examples of non-traditional distance learning schools, and all went through a natural development cycle, starting with print-based materials and then incorporating relevant technology as it became available. Some of these tools that were being used back then were too expensive or unavailable for individual learners. But by the early to mid 1980s, there was a big change in distance education. And this was when computers, home computers in particular, modems and telecommunications networks became widely available to the public and to educational institutions. The 1980s, I termed this the flowering of online education, because at this time, in this decade in particular, there was a huge growth in the different types of online services and the different types of tools for education that could be used. What I'll be talking about are the three broad areas that I've classified this into for online education. One being research and information retrieval, the second being communications and information exchange, and the third, teaching. And that's the area that I'm most experienced in, because that's what I've been doing since 1986. As I said, during this time, there was growth in the types of online tools. And when I say tools, I'm talking about the separate things that you can use, for example, email, databases, interactive message boards. Also, the networks were coming on. So what we had were communications networks that were being designed for school administrators and teachers in kind of a local or regional area. There were also university networks that were coming online from the various universities. Private companies were developing educational services. And on a very local level, bulletin board systems were coming online. And eventually the large general interest networks that we're familiar with, that the public were able to access. At that time, in the early 80s, the home computers and modems were becoming very affordable. For example, the Commodore 64 computer was selling for about $150 in 1983, and you could buy a 300 baud modem for less than $100. 300 baud seems pretty slow, but it worked well. Often a modem would come with a free membership to one of the large commercial online networks. So what happened with this was that it brought computers and telecommunications technology into the homes in huge numbers. So the first major area of online education deals with research and information retrieval. And there were several companies that were providing essentially library materials, abstracts of books, periodicals, full text articles, even encyclopedias and other referenced materials. That gradually they were becoming more and more accessible to the public. At first they were on university networks, but then we see that as we go through, the public was more able to access these. Schools at that time, as you've been informed in prior talks, schools were asked to teach computer literacy. And part of this was to teach students how to telecommunicate and how to perform online searches. One of the big bibliographic research companies was BRS, Bibliographic Retrieval Service. And they started back in 1977. I became familiar with them in the 80s when I was doing research for these various articles that I was writing. So researchers could find document citations and summaries. They could get full text of documents also. BRS had over 50 million documents online, which is huge for that time period. And that was in a wide range of fields, such as health, finance, education, biosciences. And you could order hard copies of the citations, or you could just view them online. What is most interesting to me is that companies like this were targeting the school market, and they were providing these discount programs for schools. BRS was offering what they called the BRS Instructor Program. And what they did was they made, out of the whole bunch of databases that they had, they selected a certain number and they provided those to elementary schools, secondary schools, and even up into the college level. And the BRS Instructor Program was designed specifically to teach students how to telecommunicate and how to perform online data searches. BRS also offered free online training sessions to teachers. The major objective was to teach the students how to perform fast and accurate online retrieval. And these skills were so valuable that schools started up interscholastic online competitions. I thought that was kind of interesting. A second program was BRS Educator, and that was more designed for professional educators who wanted to do research on the system. Dialogue was another big player at the time. Dialogue Information Retrieval Service. It was very popular, and it held 300 databases, and they also were offering programs targeted at schools. They had what they called the Classroom Instruction Program, and through this they offered school discounts like BRS did. It was originally aimed at colleges that were using the system for researching library science, medicine, nursing, and law. But the high schools started to demand access to the network. So Dialogue opened up some of its databases to the high schools. They created what they called the Knowledge Index. It was an easier to use version of the system with access to 25 databases. And it was specifically designed for elementary and high school students for use at nighttime. Users of the system would receive a student workbook with lessons and exercises that taught how to log into the Knowledge Index and how to use the various search techniques. Students learned how to retrieve citations to articles and abstracts, and then they would locate the actual book or the article from their local library, or they could order it through the Interlibrary Loan Service. Communications was becoming an important part of schools' activities, and Dialogue, in response to this, actually developed their own email service called Dial Mail. Grolier Electronic Publishing, they were very big in the education market back in the 80s. And they were probably most well known for the Academic American Encyclopedia that they provided online. It first went online in 1981, and that was on CompuServe. Throughout the 80s, you could see this encyclopedia on most of the other networks too. They were also on Dow Jones News Retrieval very early on. They were also very active in the educational software market. And eventually, when CD-ROM became available in the mid-80s, they put their encyclopedia on CD-ROM. They had a computer-based software program called the Information Connection. And that was a software program that they designed for schools, which was meant to teach the students telecommunications. The student could essentially simulate logging onto CompuServe with this software program. And so they could learn all the steps that they would need to do for a real live session. And the program itself could be used as a real terminal later on. So as you can see, during the 80s, we could see kind of an expansion of the research materials that were becoming available to the public online. And later on, many of these became available on the larger general interest networks. The second area of online education dealt with communications and information exchange. Now, email, of course, email today is second nature, but back in the early 80s, it was still a new thing. And in terms of its use within the area of distance education, email replaced surface mail. It was when this came in, it was a real game changer because it made the communication between the student and the teacher much faster. You didn't have to wait for the mail delivery. So this was a very significant tool that allowed the students from various remote locations to communicate quickly from their home computers to the distant instructor or school administrator. Email was a standard feature in the online networks and the bulletin board systems of the day. Private companies and universities were also implementing their own email systems. There were a lot of companies that were providing email services. Their network was dedicated totally to email. And there were even companies that would allow you to send email to someone who didn't have a computer. So for example, MCI Mail, which was very big back then, and EasyLink, you could email to one of their centers and they would print the email, they would address the envelope, and then they would ship it either US mail or some other way. They would deliver it to the recipient. So it was really coming into all areas and including everybody in one way or another. One of the limitations of email, if you were on a network, is that you could only send emails to someone else who was on the same network. But there were exceptions. The Delphi network, for example, you could send email to members of the source or to CompuServe. So that was an early example of how you could kind of overcome that limitation. By the 1990s, when the internet became available, of course, this limitation was limited and you could email anybody. Email continues to be a tool that is crucial to online education, even up to these days now. Still in the area of communications here and information exchange, the University of Michigan opened up what they called their Confer system in 1975. And they called it conferencing, but it was actually asynchronous communication using message boards. But this was one of the earliest networks to actually use message boards, and they opened it up to the public. It was started at the University of Michigan, but as time went by the time I was researching this, which would have been probably 1985, 86, You can see that my article here was from 1986. They had opened it up to the public. So they had areas here where you could do, you had private, what they called conferences, and they also had public ones. And we're familiar with that today with the forums where you can chat with each other about different subject areas. They had a threading system, which they called it agendas, but it was the same concept. You could log in and talk with others around the country about whatever subject area you were interested in. The School of Education's Professional Development Office was organizing these conferences for external education associations. And so there were private conference areas set up, for example, for the Secondary School Principals Association, Michigan Science Teachers Association, even for the University of Michigan academic departments, the faculty could use them. So this is another tool, which later on, as we get into more modern times, you can see these tools like email, message boards. These are all going to be things that we can use for infrastructure to actually operate an online school successfully. Back in the mid 80s, there were professional networks that were designed specifically for educators and education groups. And I wrote about this again, this was in 1986, but it began in 1983. This was in the state of Texas. They set up what they called the Electric Pages services, and it was specifically targeted to the various education associations and groups in Texas so that they could get together and they could communicate and they could share information and news about what was happening in Texas. So you can see from their main menu over here on the right, they had groups like the Texas Education Agency, Texas Association of School Boards, University Interscholastic League, all kinds of groups that were that dealt with education in their state. And as time went by, I mean, they were using message boards and they had email. They were providing the network so that people could get the information that they needed about what was happening. But they found that it was quite popular, and as time went by, they added on more groups. They invited more groups to join in. And in particular, they added an area for teens. You can see it further down on the screen here, for teen issues. And what they were doing here was that they were trying to get the teens from the high school level involved in telecommunications. And the network itself was a way to approach these students and invite them to come online and learn how to log into a system, how to read messages, how to respond to messages, so that they were learning how to telecommunicate by logging into the system. School districts would actually pay for a subscription to the network, and their students and teachers could log into the system. They didn't have real-time chat rooms on the system, but they primarily were using databases for uploading and downloading files and email and message boards for communication. They actually sold hardware and software also to the schools, and they had an 800 number, so they tried to make it very easy for people to get there. So the third broad area of online education deals with teaching. And as I said earlier, this is where my contribution comes in, and I'll get to that pretty soon. But first, I want to talk about some of the early participants in online teaching. So while communications and research services were expanding online, organizations and schools were also developing and experimenting with various methods of online teaching. And it's interesting because there wasn't just one way of doing it. You can see when you study these organizations and schools that were doing this, that everyone was doing it in a slightly different way. And it's actually quite good because it made it so that they could reach more students, and students who maybe couldn't participate in one particular type of online education, they could go and participate in another way. Or if their needs were different, they could join a different service. They were using the communication and research services, communication tools that we've talked about already. And we can see that when we get into these, that the methods that they were using for teaching actually reflect that original plan that was developed way back in the 1800s for correspondence education. The tools that they were using were email message boards, file libraries, online research services. One of the earliest companies that I researched dealing with this was actually Control Data's HomeLink network. And the HomeLink network was actually a part of the broader Plato system. Control Data was an early provider of online education through its Plato network, and it offered computer-based courses, programmed learning. Plato was developed at the University of Illinois in the early 1960s, and it was mostly used by private businesses and industry for training employees. Now, by 1983, Control Data opened up parts of the Plato network to the public for evening and weekend access under the name of HomeLink Network. And this is what I'm showing you here. Again, this is one of the articles that I wrote back then. HomeLink was an interactive educational software library, and it contained 450 different programmed courses and lessons for all ages, all different ages. You would log into the system and you would do the lessons while you were actually online. The courses were totally computer-based and they were self-paced. You didn't get any supplemental textbooks or course materials. Everything that you needed was right there in the software program that you were running while you were online. If you had a question, you could post that in a message board for the HomeLink staff or other users to answer. So there was that communication tool that was available. The educational programs that were on HomeLink consisted of tutorials, drill and practice, and simulations, similar programs to what I showed you early on, where people were writing education programs actually in BASIC on their Commodores. It was interactive, and most of the courses provided high-resolution graphics, and there was also animation. You could sign on and take a 30-minute lesson in addition, or you could sign up for an entire 176 lesson course in Spanish, for example. The network also had games, and they had a very unique aspect to this system, which was an editing tool. It made it so that you could write or edit your own computer-based programs and documents while you were online. And this was very valuable for teachers and students and even for programmers, because you could design and create your own lessons right there on the system. They had a text editor and a graphics editor that you could use. You would store your lessons on their system. They didn't have an upload or download features. They didn't have the file libraries. But you could store them there, and you could make them available either to the public, or you could have them available just to your particular students. Control Data developed their own terminal software, and excuse me, they sold terminal software on disk for IBM PCs that had a graphics card, and also on cartridge for the 8-bit Atari computers. An interesting aspect of the Atari version was that the Atari users had complete color options, and they also had a zoom feature. The Atari users also had what they called a touchscreen simulation, which was implemented through a joystick. Another online school back then, which was very popular, was Telelearning's Electronic University Network. And that began in 1983. EUN was a communications network. It wasn't a school. You would buy a course disk, a textbook, and a system disk. And you would log into the system and send email to your instructor. So it was primarily a communications network. They originally designed it for Commodore 64 users. And later they expanded it for Apple and IBM PCs. They initially were starting by offering non-credit personal enrichment courses for the home market. But later on, they changed their direction. And by 1987, they were serving primarily corporate employees who wanted to take courses for college credit. They worked with several colleges, and by 1987, they had agreements with Edison State College, JFK University, and the State University of New York Regents College, where students could take their courses with an instructor from a different university, but using the EU system. And then they could earn credits, or they could even earn a degree at one of those colleges. Nova University in Florida was an early provider of distance learning degrees. They started actually back in 1972 with a distance education doctoral degree in educational administration. By the mid 80s, 83 to 86, they added more programs, and they actually had 5 graduate programs that you can see listed here. Their focus was to teach primarily computers in education, technology, computer science, computer-based learning. And how it worked was that the students would do most of their studying offline at home, and then they would use their computer to log into the Nova network using a TimeNet or a Telenet packet switch network. And they would use the Nova University network to submit assignments, ask questions, take tests, and communicate through email with the instructors. They didn't have real-time online classes. Nova also required that their students attend in-person regional seminars periodically throughout the year. On the local level, bulletin board systems were springing up. I wrote an article about this one called the electric chalkboard. This was from Texas, and an English teacher named Ken Blystone, he was also a computer literacy teacher. In response to the state of Texas mandating computer literacy to be taught in all 7th and 8th grades, he started up a local bulletin board of his own. And he invited the teachers from the local area to develop courses and post the lessons online, and then have their students log in for after-school enrichment courses. So this was a nice early version of an online school that was based on in a local area. They, in addition to the email and the message boards and the file libraries, this BBS also had the text-based chat rooms, so they were able to use synchronous communication. So this was a good early example of how local BBS could be used as an effective teaching platform. The large general interest networks, which you're probably familiar with, were coming in at this time, and CompuServe was one of the leaders. They had originally started out with Grolier's Academic Encyclopedia, but soon, by 1986, they had added all these other services that you can see on the right dealing with education. They had online quizzes, they had message boards, areas where you could chat back and forth. But what was missing is that they didn't have tutoring courses taught in real-time classrooms. And this is where I start to come in, putting it all together. By the mid-'80s, we had message boards, we had real-time chat classrooms, we had file libraries, online quizzes, online research and reference materials, and email for private feedback on homework. So when I was working at Ron, I was able to get in early on the Quantum Link network, which came out in November of '85. And when Quantum Link first came out, my area of interest, of course, was the Learning Center. I sent a proposal to them. When they first started, they had an encyclopedia and a catalog of telelearning courses. So I sent a proposal to them in 1986 to design and operate a tutoring center and a course center. And they accepted that. So I became a provider on their network for those services. We started right off with the tutoring center, and this is a blurry picture because it's a picture of a video that I took of tutoring sessions. You know, it doesn't have that great resolution, but hopefully you can see what we have here in the tutoring center. We've got our main menu up at the top. And how I designed it was by academic departments. So we had English, math, science and health, computer science, general studies. Within each of those academic departments, we had message boards and download libraries. So the students could communicate back and forth through the message boards with their teachers, and the download libraries were there so that the teachers could provide materials to supplement their real-time instruction. We had classrooms, which were the chat-based classrooms. Actually, you can see at the bottom here where the teacher, we call them Q tutors, is typing to the students. We also had online quizzes. So QLink was providing all of the tools that were needed to run an online school. It was very useful. This particular shot is the chemistry class where you can see the students in the top box here, and down below you can see the teacher, Q tutor BH, discussing compounds, I guess, some aspect of chemistry. So they were going back and forth. We also offered real-time spelling bee, which was something that we did every month. So the tutoring center was different in that I designed it around the real-time classrooms, and we were using these other tools as tools that could be used for communication and also for reference materials, because students could access files that the teachers had put into the libraries, and they could also access the encyclopedia for research. This slide shows the weekly schedule, a typical weekly schedule of our tutoring center. And these schedules, as well as schedules of other services that were on the network, would be provided through the QLink update. We didn't charge for tutoring. The students would pay $3.60 an hour, which was the QLink rate, and their monthly subscription of $9.95. These were drop-in sessions, and I scheduled them for 1 hour sessions, and they were mostly in the evening, which was the cheapest time for accessing the system, and also on weekends. Right off the bat, we had people who were saying, hey, we'd like to have more structured courses. So I started offering, working with the teachers to offer courses. First of all, it was through the tutoring center, but it was so busy that we broke it off into a separate area, and I created the QLink Community College and ran that on QLink from '87 to 1990. I also developed the parent-teacher information exchange on that network, which was essentially a way for teachers and parents to share information, file programs, software programs, educational programs. Quantum Link, many of you are probably already familiar with this, but Quantum Link then developed they duplicated their services essentially onto PC Link and Apple Link in 1988. And so I went with them and opened up the Tutoring Center and the Calc Course Center on those other networks. So I got to the point where I was using a Commodore computer for the Q-Link network, an IBM type computer for the PC Link, and an Apple II for the Apple Link. So you had to have a particular type of a computer to access the network. So I moved on in 1989, 1990 to Genie, the General Electric Network, and I left Quantum in 1990. Basically what I did there was I took my same concept and I opened up the Tutoring Center and the Course Center. So that I ran on Genie from 89 to about 90, 96, something like that. Yes. And I also operated for a few years on Delphi and on CompuServe. By the time we get to the mid-90s, I was at the point where I wanted to develop my own system. And so I did. And the way that I did it was by developing an in-house bulletin board system. And by that time, we were able to hook it up to the internet, and students and teachers would telnet in from around the world. When we were on the other networks, we were doing scheduled classes in real-time sessions. And we were essentially serving the United States. So we had East Coast to the West Coast, and we could do that in the time frame that we had on the quantum networks, and also when we went on to Genie. But once I was able to open it up to the international audience, then the time zones became a challenge, because you couldn't have a real-time class at 8 p.m. and the time over in Eastern Europe or someplace like that was 7 or 8 hours different. So what I did was I developed a second type of second method of offering the courses, and that was through directed independent study. We had 3 ways to access the service. You could come in through a web browser onto what was called web lines, or you could come in through directly into the bulletin board system with the World Group plugin program, which was a graphic user interface, or you could telnet in through a plain text mode. Since I'm getting short on time, I'm just going to go quickly through the end here. We had different methods of lesson delivery, and I did that because the students had different types of hardware and they had different speeds of internet connections. So I wanted to serve as many people as we could. So we had, through our web lines system, you could post the lessons for your course. This one is basic English in an HTML format. So any web browser could come to the website and click on the links and download and view or print the lessons. Or if the student had, an IBM computer, at that time it was IBM compatible, or a Mac, they could download the plugin for World Group and actually telnet into our system, come into our file libraries and download the files. You can see here that the lessons are primarily text lessons, but up at the top, you've got en200.exe, and that was a self-extracting all-in-one disk text. And here's a picture of that. It was a hypertext program where the teachers were able to put all of the lessons into one file, and then the student, all the student had to do was download that one file, and they could run it offline. It was a DOS-based program. The teleconference rooms that we had for chat we had, the typical chat room where you would type into the chat window down below, and above you could see the conversation. And we still are using that today in many cases. And our World Group interface was very good because it also had a drawing board. So teachers could draw graphics, and they could also be chatting back and forth with the student at the same time. By the time we got up to 2007, we became regionally accredited. And my talk is really not talking about the modern day stuff, but I just want to show you we advanced, and anticipating a larger student body, which we did get. I moved from the bulletin board system that we were running into a hosted course management system, and this is Moodle. And we've been operating on Moodle system right up until present day. It basically provides the same features that we had been using, but it's designed specifically for teaching. And, there's many different course management systems out there nowadays. But the advantage is that you have reports on student activity. You can post comments to students on their homework and on exams right there in the system instead of using email. It's quite good. Okay, so to wrap it up here, what have we learned? Back in the 80s, there was a lot of activity in the field of online education. There were research services, information retrieval, communication services, and there were teaching networks and teaching bulletin board systems. Many of the tools that we used back then are the same ones that we're using today. There were message boards for interaction between the teachers and the students. There were file libraries for downloading and uploading, email, real-time chat rooms for classroom teaching, online quizzes, and reference materials online. But the advancements that we see today are significant, and that is that we have what I'm using right now, video room, video classroom, essentially, advanced graphics, audio video materials that are provided online, and course management systems that are specifically designed for teaching, where you can have online grade books and activity reports, and you can actually post comments to students right there in the system as opposed to going into email. So with that, that pretty much finishes it for what I wanted to say. And if you want to find out any more information about the early days of online education, you can go to my website, calcampus.edu/research.htm. And there I've provided a lot of my writings from the early days in this area of education. Also, I've put up there the one of the videos that I took of Q-Link, the Spelling Bee classroom from the Tutoring Center, in case you're interested in that. And these are the 3 books that you might be interested in. Vintage Commodore 128 Personal Computer Handbook, the Online Distance Education Historical Perspective and Practical Application, and Bill Hurd's book, Back into the Storm. So that's it.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Everyone give her a big hand. Do we have any questions for her? We still have 6 minutes. Yes.
Quick question. On the idea of students when you first started, there may have been, technology issues or access. How is it different than the current students you're working with that are super tech savvy and have lots of access?
All right, so the question is, how did it compare students in the past to students in the present day, and how they accessed it, how they behaved, and et cetera?
Well, I would say the students way back then were a lot more excited about it. They were very enthusiastic. They were using their computers. This was brand new technology that they were using. So, like, for example, on the Q-Link network, it just seems that everyone was a lot happier back then. I think that's how I would encapsulate that. But in terms of actual communication and the operation, it's pretty much the same, I'd say.
Thank you.
All right, he says thanks. Any other questions for Margaret? Nope, doesn't look like any more questions. You were very thorough.
Okay.
Well, we
right.
appreciate you coming, doing a second talk, went into detail more about, I liked it a lot because, told the deep history back to the 1800s and then the more recent in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I was not aware of all of that. I hadn't even considered the idea of that. I sort of think about now, when COVID happened, all the teachers were forced to go to online teaching, and that became a difficult way to teach because it's, we are social animals and it's difficult to interact with people in a natural and easy way. Did you have issues with how you interacted with people in terms of understanding? Some people didn't understand as easily in the format that you had to do.
Well, early on, when we're dealing with, where you're typing back and forth,
Yes.
the problem there was that it was slow communication. So you're typing to a student in a real-time classroom, and the student has to wait for that to pop up on his screen. So the speed of the communication back and forth was slower in the real-time classrooms, and that would make people have to be more patient. And if you were ever using Q-Link back then, you would know what I mean, because sometimes you would be waiting for that message to come back, and it's like, okay, when's it going to come? Especially at 300 baud. But now with the being able to see each other and almost instantaneous back and forth, it just makes the communication so much better, so much easier.
Yeah, I think they take for granted how fast it is, instantaneous. You can do Google Meet, you can talk to them, you can do screen sharing, you can share files. I think the kids nowadays take for granted that the technology that we have now compared to then, where there's a lot of patience required. You don't have the on-screen drawing and anything like that to look at.
Right. Just we had that whiteboard back in '95, which at that point seemed to be a big deal, but compared to what you can do nowadays, it doesn't really hold a candle to what you can do today.
All right. Well, thank you, Margaret. And one more time, everyone give her a big hand.
Okay, you're welcome.